January 1942. In the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler convened his military leadership to assess the strategic situation following Germany's declaration of war on the United States. The Führer was dismissive, almost contemptuous. America, he told his generals, was a mongrel nation, weakened by democracy, divided by racial conflict, corrupted by capitalism and consumerism. Its people were soft, accustomed to luxury, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice required for modern industrial warfare. The United States, Hitler assured his staff, would take years to mobilize, if it could mobilize effectively at all. Its society was too fractured, its government too inefficient, its people too individualistic to wage sustained war against the disciplined might of the Third Reich. The Wehrmacht's intelligence assessments supported this view. German analysts noted America's small peacetime army, smaller than Romania's. They observed industrial strikes, political divisions, isolationist sentiment. They concluded that American democracy, with its endless debates and competing interests, could never achieve the unity of purpose that totalitarian control provided. Even if America eventually mobilized its economy, German planners believed it would produce luxury goods masquerading as military equipment, over-engineered, unreliable, unsuited to the brutal realities of combat. The United States, in the Nazi worldview, was a nation of shopkeepers and consumers, not warriors and producers. That same month, 3,000 miles west in Richmond, California, industrialist Henry Kaiser stood in a shipyard that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. Around him, welders worked in shifts around the clock, cutting and joining prefabricated steel sections with industrial efficiency that would have seemed impossible to pre-war maritime engineers. Kaiser watched as a 10,000-ton Liberty ship, a cargo vessel capable of carrying 2,840 jeeps, 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of ammunition, slid down the ways into San Francisco Bay. 4 days and 15 hours had elapsed since the keel was laid. In 18 months, Kaiser's yards would launch a Liberty ship in 4 days routinely. In 2 years, as a publicity demonstration, they would complete one in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes from keel laying to launch. This was the miscalculation that would help decide World War II. Germany believed America would fight like a nation of consumers, unable to match European discipline and industrial tradition. Instead, it awakened a nation of producers, and that awakening would bury the Third Reich under an avalanche of ships, aircraft, vehicles, and weapons that German industry, for all its vaunted efficiency, could never hope to match. The war would be decided not primarily by battlefield heroics or tactical brilliance, but by production lines, supply chains, and the quiet, relentless power of an industrial democracy that Nazi ideology insisted could not exist. What Germany thought America was. The Nazi assessment of American weakness wasn't casual prejudice. It was embedded in the ideological foundations of the regime. Hitler's racial theories posited that multiracial societies were inherently weaker than ethnically homogeneous ones, that democracy bred softness and indecision, that capitalist individualism prevented the kind of collective mobilization that fascism achieved. These weren't just propaganda talking points. They shaped strategic planning at the highest levels. German intelligence reports from the 1930s painted America as a nation in decline. They documented labor strikes, unemployment during the Depression, racial segregation and violence, political gridlock. The German General Staff noted that America's standing army in 1939 numbered approximately 190,000 men, smaller than Belgium's, smaller than Poland's, ranking 19th in the world. American tanks were obsolete, its aircraft outdated, its doctrine untested. The United States had no serious armaments industry to speak of. Most of its industrial capacity produced automobiles, refrigerators, radios, consumer goods that seemed frivolous to military planners. More fundamentally, Nazi ideology insisted that democracy itself was a fatal weakness. Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf that democratic societies, paralyzed by debate and divided by competing interests, could never achieve the unity of will necessary for total war. The German system, centralized, authoritarian, capable of directing all national resources toward military ends, seemed self-evidently superior. When German planners looked at America, they saw endless congressional committees, union negotiations, corporate profit motives, state versus federal conflicts, a political system that seemed designed to prevent decisive action. This ideological certainty led to catastrophic intelligence failures. German analysts discounted information that contradicted their preconceptions. When reports arrived describing American industrial expansion in 1940 and 1941, they were dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. When intelligence officers noted American aircraft production figures, German planners assumed the numbers were inflated or that the aircraft were inferior. The idea that American workers, many of them women, many without formal engineering training, many from racial and ethnic groups that Nazi ideology deemed inferior, could match or exceed the output of German craftsmen seemed absurd. Even the physical geography of America worked against German understanding. Europe's industrial centers were concentrated, vulnerable to strategic bombing, dependent on rail networks that could be interdicted. American industry sprawled across a continent protected by two oceans, with productive capacity distributed among dozens of cities, redundant transportation networks, and resources that seemed limitless compared to Europe's constraints. German planners, thinking in European terms, couldn't fully grasp the implications of American scale. The arsenal of democracy is born. The transformation of American industry from peacetime to wartime production remains one of the most remarkable organizational achievements in modern history. It happened with a speed and completeness that shocked observers, including many Americans themselves. In 1939, the United States produced 2,141 military aircraft. In 1944, it produced 96,318. In 1940, American shipyards launched 102 merchant ships. In 1943, they launched 1,949. These weren't incremental improvements. They represented a fundamental restructuring of the American economy. The process began before Pearl Harbor, accelerated by Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy speech in December 1940 and the Lend-Lease Act of March 1941. The federal government didn't nationalize industry. Instead, it created incentives, guaranteed markets, streamlined regulations, and coordinated production in ways that leveraged private sector efficiency while directing it toward national ends. Companies that had never produced military equipment were brought into the effort. Automobile manufacturers retooled to build tanks and aircraft. Appliance makers produced ammunition. Toy companies manufactured compasses and precision instruments. The key was standardization combined with mass production. American engineers designed weapons and equipment that could be manufactured quickly, maintained easily, and produced in enormous quantities. This was a conscious choice, a strategic decision that German planners misunderstood. German industry emphasized precision, craftsmanship, incremental improvement. Each Tiger tank was a masterpiece of engineering, but complex and time-consuming to produce. American industry emphasized reliability, interchangeability, and volume. A Sherman tank was simpler than a Panther, but America could produce 5 Shermans in the time Germany produced 1 Panther, and every part in every Sherman was identical, making field maintenance possible. The workforce transformation was equally dramatic. Millions of women entered industrial jobs previously reserved for men. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda, but a reflection of fundamental social change driven by wartime necessity. African Americans migrated from the rural South to northern industrial cities, finding employment in defense plants despite persistent discrimination. Farm workers became factory workers. Teenagers worked in shipyards. The unemployed masses of the Depression became the industrial army that would outproduce the rest of the world combined. Training systems were created to turn inexperienced workers into skilled operators in weeks rather than years. Henry Kaiser's shipyards hired workers with no maritime experience and put them through intensive training programs that taught specific tasks efficiently. Ford's Willow Run plant developed assembly line techniques that broke bomber construction into learnable steps. The traditional apprenticeship model, years of training under master craftsmen, was replaced by task-specific instruction that could create competent workers quickly. Federal coordination was essential but often invisible. The War Production Board allocated raw materials, set production priorities, resolved conflicts between competing demands. The Maritime Commission designed standard ship types and distributed contracts. The Army Air Forces worked with manufacturers to standardize aircraft components. This wasn't central planning in the Soviet sense. Companies competed for contracts, innovation was encouraged, efficiency was rewarded, but it created coherence across thousands of independent operations. Liberty ships and the death of the U-boat strategy. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, believed he could win the war in the Atlantic through simple arithmetic. His submarines, he calculated, needed to sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them. If monthly sinkings exceeded monthly construction, Britain would eventually be starved into submission, cut off from American supplies, unable to serve as a base for eventual invasion of Europe. In early 1942, Dönitz's calculations seemed sound. U-boats were sinking Allied ships at rates approaching 700,000 tons per month. Allied shipbuilding, still geared toward traditional methods, couldn't keep pace. What Dönitz didn't anticipate was the Liberty ship program and the revolution in shipbuilding it represented. The Liberty ship was designed by a consortium of American naval architects as a simple, standardized emergency cargo vessel. It was not elegant. Maritime engineers called it ugly, slow, and crude. It was welded rather than riveted, powered by obsolete triple expansion steam engines, built to minimal specifications. But it could be mass-produced using techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing, and that made all the difference. Henry Kaiser, who had never built a ship before the war, revolutionized the process. His shipyards used prefabrication. Entire sections of the ship were assembled in workshops, then moved to the ways and joined together. This allowed parallel construction. While one ship was being assembled on the ways, sections for the next ships were being built simultaneously in the fabrication shops. Workers specialized in specific tasks rather than learning entire trades. Welding, faster than riveting, became the primary joining method. The construction time for a Liberty ship dropped from 230 days in early 1942 to 42 days by late 1943. The numbers tell the story. In 1941, American shipyards delivered 1.1 million tons of merchant shipping. In 1942, they delivered 8.1 million tons. In 1943, 19.2 million tons. The program eventually produced 2,710 Liberty ships, each capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. To put this in perspective, in 1942, German U-boats sank approximately 1,150 Allied ships totaling 6.2 million tons. That same year, American yards alone launched ships totaling 8.1 million tons, and that figure doesn't include construction by British, Canadian, and other Allied yards. Dönitz's arithmetic collapsed. Even during the worst months of the U-boat campaign, Allied shipbuilding outpaced sinkings. The tonnage available to carry supplies across the Atlantic increased steadily throughout the war, even as U-boats continued to sink individual ships. By mid-1943, when improved anti-submarine warfare tactics began to turn the tide decisively against the U-boats, the production battle was already won. The Atlantic had become a math problem Germany could no longer win. The implications extended beyond raw tonnage. Liberty ships carried the tanks, trucks, aircraft, fuel, ammunition, and supplies that would eventually overwhelm German forces in Europe. They carried food and raw materials to Britain, keeping the island nation functioning as an airbase and staging ground. They carried Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union, over $11 billion worth of equipment that Stalin himself acknowledged as critical to Soviet survival. Each Liberty ship represented not just cargo capacity, but American industrial power made tangible and sent across the ocean. German naval officers recognized what was happening. In his memoirs, Dönitz described the growing realization that the U-boat campaign, for all its tactical successes, was failing strategically because American production exceeded his most pessimistic estimates. German intelligence had predicted American shipbuilding would peak at perhaps 3 million tons annually. When the actual figure reached 19 million tons, it became clear that fundamental assumptions about American industrial capacity had been catastrophically wrong. Willow Run and the Impossible Bomber Factory. In 1940, the Ford Motor Company agreed to build B-24 Liberator heavy bombers at a new plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan. The B-24 was one of the most complex aircraft in the world, a four-engine bomber with 1.2 million parts, 360,000 rivets, requiring precision manufacturing and skilled assembly. Traditional aircraft production was essentially custom work. Small teams of skilled craftsmen building each aircraft individually in small batches. The Army Air Force's estimated production rates of perhaps a few dozen bombers per month from a large factory. Henry Ford proposed something different. He would build the largest manufacturing facility in the world. A single building covering 3.5 million square feet, with an assembly line over a mile long. He would adapt automobile production techniques to aircraft construction, breaking the process into repeatable tasks that could be performed by workers with minimal training. He would produce B-24s the way Ford produced cars, continuously, efficiently, in massive quantities. Military aviation experts were skeptical. Aircraft, they insisted, weren't automobiles. Each bomber required precise tolerances, skilled craftsmanship, individual attention. The riveting alone required trained workers who understood the structural requirements of aircraft assembly. The idea of turning out bombers on an assembly line seemed to violate everything the industry knew about aircraft production. Willow Run proved them wrong, though not without difficulties. The plant opened in 1942 and immediately encountered problems. Workers, many hired from farms and small towns with no manufacturing experience, struggled with complex tasks. Training programs had to be developed from scratch. Housing for workers was inadequate. Tens of thousands of people had relocated to work at Willow Run, and the surrounding area lacked infrastructure to support them. Labor turnover was high. Initial production rates were disappointing, but Ford's engineers persisted, refining the process constantly. They broke bomber construction into thousands of individual tasks, each simple enough to be learned quickly. They developed specialized tools and jigs that guided workers through complex operations. They created training programs that could turn a farmhand into a competent riveter in 2 weeks. They built dormitories, cafeterias, bus systems to support the workforce. Slowly, then rapidly, production accelerated. By 1944, Willow Run was producing one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. The mile-long assembly line moved continuously, with partially completed bombers advancing through stages of construction as workers added components, installed systems, and performed inspections. At peak production, Willow Run employed 42,000 workers operating in 3 shifts around the clock. Women made up a significant portion of the workforce. By 1944, over 40% of Willow Run workers were female, performing tasks from riveting to engine installation to test piloting. The plant ultimately produced 8,685 B-24 bombers, roughly half of all B-24s built during the war. Combine Willow Run's output with B-24 production at Consolidated's San Diego plant, Douglas's Tulsa plant, and North American's Dallas plant, and American industry delivered over 18,000 of this single bomber type. Add in B-17 Flying Fortresses, 12,731 produced, B-25 Mitchells, 9,816, B-29 Superfortresses, 3,970, and other types, and the numbers become almost incomprehensible. American factories built approximately 96,000 military aircraft in 1944 alone. German aircraft production, by comparison, peaked at approximately 40,000 military aircraft in 1944, despite desperate efforts to increase output. The Germans built excellent aircraft: the Me-262 jet fighter, the FW-190 fighter bomber, the Ju-88 night fighter were all technically sophisticated machines. But they couldn't build them in sufficient quantities to offset losses, couldn't train pilots fast enough to replace those killed, couldn't fuel them adequately as Allied bombing and advancing armies disrupted oil production. German fighters shot down hundreds of American bombers, but the Americans replaced them faster than the Germans could destroy them, and the bombers kept coming. American adaptability after failure. In February 1943, American forces suffered a humiliating defeat at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. German armor under Erwin Rommel attacked American positions, routed inexperienced units, destroyed hundreds of vehicles, and drove American forces back 50 miles in some sectors. It was the first major engagement between American and German ground forces in the European theater, and it seemed to confirm German assumptions. American troops were poorly led, inadequately trained, tactically naive, unable to match veteran Wehrmacht forces. Rommel wrote to his wife describing the engagement. The Americans had learned nothing. They were overconfident, their dispositions were poor, their coordination was lacking. If this is the quality of force we face, we have little to fear from the eventual American buildup. German intelligence reports echoed this assessment, noting that while American equipment was abundant, American troops lacked the combat experience and tactical sophistication of German veterans. What happened next surprised German commanders. The Americans learned with shocking speed. Within weeks of Kasserine Pass, American doctrine began to change. Officers who had performed poorly were relieved and replaced. Units underwent intensive retraining incorporating lessons from the battle. Equipment deficiencies were identified and addressed. Better radios, improved coordination between armor and infantry, enhanced artillery support procedures. Tank-destroyer doctrine was revised. Air-ground coordination improved. By the time American forces engaged German troops again at El Getter in March 1943, they fought differently. The same divisions that had been routed at Kasserine held their ground, coordinated combined arms effectively, and inflicted significant casualties on attacking German forces. Rommel, facing unexpectedly stiff resistance, noted in his papers that American forces had improved dramatically and were now fighting with greater skill and determination. This adaptability, the ability to learn from failure, incorporate lessons rapidly, and improve performance systematically, was one of America's most important advantages, and one that German commanders consistently underestimated. German military culture emphasized following doctrine, maintaining discipline, executing plans with precision. It was excellent at doing things correctly. American military culture, by contrast, emphasized pragmatism, initiative, and adaptation. It was excellent at learning to do things better. The difference showed in unexpected ways. American units routinely modified equipment in the field, adapting weapons and vehicles to meet needs their designers hadn't anticipated. Tankers welded additional armor to Shermans, created improvised hedgerow-cutting devices, modified guns and ammunition storage based on combat experience. Infantry units developed new tactics for urban combat, for hedgerow fighting, for winter warfare. When standard procedures didn't work, American commanders changed the procedures. German forces, fighting with equipment and doctrine that had been spectacularly successful in 1939 to 1941, struggled to adapt to changing circumstances. Part of this was material. German industry couldn't produce the replacement equipment needed to implement new designs quickly. But part was cultural. German military tradition valued adherence to proven methods, and the command structure didn't encourage the kind of bottom-up innovation that American forces practiced routinely. The after-action report system that American forces used contributed significantly to this learning curve. Every engagement generated detailed reports from multiple command levels, describing what happened, what worked, what failed. These reports were compiled, analyzed, and distributed throughout the Army, turning individual experiences into institutional knowledge. Tank commanders in Italy learned from experiences in North Africa. Infantry in France benefited from lessons learned in Italy. The entire military system functioned as a learning organization, improving continuously based on systematic feedback. By 1944, the American forces that landed in Normandy were fundamentally more capable than the forces that had fought in North Africa 18 months earlier. They weren't more heroic. Heroism had been present all along, but they were more competent, better trained, equipped with improved weapons, fighting according to doctrine refined through hard experience. German commanders facing these forces found themselves fighting an enemy that learned faster than they could exploit weaknesses, burying the Wehrmacht in equipment. The decisive factor in ground combat wasn't tactical brilliance or individual courage. It was logistics, the unglamorous science of supply and replacement. American forces fought with an abundance of equipment that German commanders found almost incomprehensible. An American infantry division in 1944 had approximately 2,000 vehicles, most of them trucks for moving supplies. A German infantry division had perhaps 600 vehicles, many of them horse-drawn. An American armored division could move 100 miles in a day, supplied by a logistics tail that could keep it fed, fueled, and armed continuously. A German armored division, dependent on rail transport and limited truck assets, struggled to maintain operations far from railheads. The production statistics tell the story. From 1940 to 1945, American industry produced 88,410 tanks and self-propelled guns, 257,000 artillery pieces, 2.4 million trucks and jeeps, 324,000 aircraft, military, 6,500 naval vessels, including 349 destroyers, 203 submarines, and thousands of landing craft, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, 12 million rifles and carbines. Germany, over the same period, produced approximately 46,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 159,000 artillery pieces, 345,000 trucks, 119,000 aircraft, military, 1,100 naval vessels. The disparity in trucks is particularly telling. Logistics, the ability to move supplies from factories to ports to depots to fighting units, determined what armies could accomplish. American forces moved on trucks. Thousands of trucks, moving continuously, bringing forward ammunition, fuel, food, replacement equipment. German forces, chronically short of trucks, depended heavily on railways and, increasingly as the war progressed, on horse-drawn wagons. The Wehrmacht in 1944 employed over 2.7 million horses for transport, more than it had used in 1939. This wasn't a romantic return to traditional methods. It was evidence of desperate material shortage. American logistic superiority meant that when equipment was destroyed or worn out, it was replaced quickly. A Sherman tank knocked out in combat might be replaced within days. Ammunition expended in battle was resupplied continuously, allowing American artillery to fire at rates German forces couldn't match. When clothing wore out, new uniforms arrived. When vehicles broke down, spare parts were available. The material abundance that Nazi ideology had dismissed as decadent consumerism became, in wartime, an overwhelming operational advantage. German units, by contrast, fought with diminishing resources. Tanks destroyed in combat often couldn't be replaced. Replacement vehicles were needed to equip new formations or make good losses on other fronts. Artillery ammunition was rationed, limiting the amount of fire support available. Fuel shortages constrained operations, forcing difficult choices about which units would receive priority for limited gasoline stocks. Spare parts became scarce, leading to higher rates of mechanical breakdown as maintenance suffered. The cumulative effect was attrition that favored America decisively. Both sides lost equipment in combat, but America replaced its losses and increased the total forces in the field, while Germany struggled to maintain force levels despite total mobilization of its economy. By 1944, American forces were growing stronger while German forces were growing weaker, not because of any single battle, but because of sustained industrial output that Germany simply could not match. What German commanders realized too late. In the final months of the war, as Germany collapsed, senior military leaders began to reckon with the miscalculations that had led to catastrophe. Their memoirs, post-war interviews, and captured documents reveal a growing recognition that fundamental assumptions about American capabilities had been disastrously wrong. Karl Dönitz, in his memoir 10 Years and 20 Days, described the shock of learning actual American production figures. We had estimated that the Americans might build 3 million tons of shipping annually at peak production. When our intelligence services reported that they were building over 19 million tons, I initially refused to believe it. When confirmation arrived, I realized that the entire strategic basis of the U-boat campaign was flawed. We could not sink ships faster than they were being built, and that meant eventual defeat in the Atlantic was inevitable. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, wrote extensively about Germany's industrial failures. In his interrogations by American officers after the war, he acknowledged that German production planning had been based on the assumption that American industry would take years to mobilize effectively. We believed that democratic inefficiency, labor disputes, and the profit motive would prevent the Americans from achieving unified direction of their economy. We were wrong. They mobilized faster and more completely than we did, and they did it without abandoning their democratic institutions. Field commanders expressed similar realizations. General der Panzertruppe Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served in North Africa and on the Eastern Front, wrote in his post-war analysis, The material superiority of our opponents became crushing. We could destroy American tanks, but they appeared again in equal numbers the next day. We could shoot down American aircraft, but the sky was always full of them. The Americans fought with an abundance of everything: ammunition, fuel, equipment, while we were rationed and constrained at every turn. Rommel, in his last months before his forced suicide, confided to associates that the war was lost because Germany had underestimated American industrial power. His chief of staff, Hans Speidel, recorded Rommel's assessment. The Feldmarschall said that we had made a fundamental error in believing the Americans would fight as individuals rather than as a system. Their system, their production, their logistics, their ability to replace losses, was defeating us regardless of our tactical successes. The realization extended beyond military leaders to economic planners. German economists analyzing the war effort concluded that Germany's production capacity, even at maximum mobilization, was insufficient to match combined Allied output. With American industry producing roughly 40% of the world's total manufacturing output in 1944, Germany's 10 to 12% share was simply inadequate for sustained global conflict, especially when fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who could draw on American production. Lend-Lease and global impact. American production didn't just support American forces. Through the Lend-Lease program, it supported every major Allied power. The statistics are staggering. From 1941 to 1945, the United States provided approximately $50 billion worth of equipment and supplies to Allied nations, roughly $690 billion in 2024 dollars. Britain received $31 billion, the Soviet Union $11 billion, China $1.6 billion, with smaller amounts going to other Allied nations. What did Lend-Lease mean in practical terms? The Soviet Union received 400,000 trucks, vehicles that allowed Soviet forces to maintain mobile operations during their 1943 to 1945 offensives. Soviet forces used American trucks to transport infantry, tow artillery, supply advancing armies. Nikita Khrushchev, reflecting on the war years, stated, "Without American production, the Soviet Union could not have won the war. We would have lost without American trucks, without American locomotives, without American steel." Britain received 31,000 aircraft, 4,000 tanks, millions of tons of food, and crucial machine tools that allowed British factories to increase their own production. British factories, bombed and strained by years of war production, benefited from American lathes, presses, and manufacturing equipment that expanded capacity without requiring British resources for machine tool production. Even smaller Allied nations benefited. Free French forces fought with American equipment. Chinese forces received aircraft, trucks, and weapons that allowed them to tie down hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops. Australian and New Zealand forces in the Pacific operated with American logistical support. The American industrial base effectively supported a global coalition, simultaneously equipping its own expanding military and providing material to allies on every continent. This had strategic implications beyond simple tonnage. Germany faced enemies on multiple fronts, each supported by American production. German forces in Russia faced Soviet armies increasingly equipped with American trucks and radios. German forces in France faced British and American armies with overwhelming material superiority. German forces in Italy fought Allied units that could call on seemingly unlimited supplies. The Wehrmacht was fighting not just American soldiers but American factories, and those factories were supporting enemies everywhere. The Lend-Lease program also represented something Nazi ideology insisted was impossible: capitalist democracy successfully organizing production for collective goals without abandoning its fundamental character. The United States remained democratic throughout the war. Elections continued on schedule, including a presidential election in 1944. Congress debated policy vigorously. Labor unions continued to exist, though strikes were discouraged. Private corporations produced war material while remaining private. The system that Hitler dismissed as weak and divided proved capable of sustained mobilization that exceeded anything the totalitarian powers achieved. The cost of misjudgment. Nazi Germany's defeat had many causes: military errors, strategic overreach, the resilience of opponents, the moral bankruptcy of the regime itself. But underlying all these factors was a miscalculation about America that shaped German strategic planning from the beginning. The belief that the United States could not and would not mobilize its full industrial and human resources for sustained warfare. This miscalculation stemmed from ideology, not analysis. Nazi racial theory insisted that multiracial democracies were weak. Nazi economic thinking assumed that capitalist individualism prevented effective collective action. Nazi cultural prejudice viewed Americans as soft, undisciplined, incapable of the hardness required for modern warfare. These beliefs were articles of faith, resistant to contrary evidence, maintained even as that evidence mounted. The result was strategic blindness. German planners, confident in their assumptions, never developed realistic estimates of American production potential. They never seriously planned for a prolonged conflict against an enemy with America's resources. They never considered that American democracy might prove more resilient and adaptable than German authoritarianism. When reality contradicted their assumptions, they dismissed the contradictions rather than revising their worldview. The irony is profound. Germany, which prided itself on military professionalism and rational planning, allowed ideology to override analysis on the most fundamental strategic question: what kind of enemy was the United States? The answer: a continental-scale industrial democracy capable of mobilizing unprecedented resources while maintaining its essential character, was discoverable through open-source analysis. American factory capacity was no secret. American resources were documented. American productivity was visible to anyone who cared to look objectively. But objectivity requires setting aside preconceptions, and Nazi ideology made that impossible. The same racial theories that justified German aggression also prevented German leaders from accurately assessing their opponents. The same authoritarian certainty that enabled rapid decision-making also created blind spots that proved fatal. Germany lost the war in significant measure because it believed its own propaganda about American weakness. The cost was catastrophic. German cities were reduced to rubble by American bombers produced at Willow Run and similar factories. German armies were destroyed by the weight of American equipment that Hitler had insisted could never be produced in decisive quantities. German submarines were hunted to extinction by escort carriers and destroyers that Dönitz calculations said couldn't exist. The war that Germany started confidently, certain of quick victory, became a grinding attrition that Germany could not win once American production reached full stride. By 1945, the disparity was absolute. American forces advancing into Germany rode in vehicles that were replaced faster than they could be destroyed, supplied by a logistics system that operated with mechanical efficiency, supported by an industrial base that was simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war against Germany and Japan. German forces defending the Reich were short of everything: fuel, ammunition, food, equipment, not because German industry had failed to mobilize, but because mobilized German industry couldn't match a fraction of American output. Germany lost World War II long before its armies collapsed in the field, long before Soviet forces raised their flag over the Reichstag, long before American and British forces crossed the Rhine. Germany lost the war in the months after Pearl Harbor, when American industry began to mobilize, when shipyards started launching Liberty ships faster than submarines could sink them, when aircraft factories began producing bombers by the thousands, when the entire productive capacity of the world's largest economy turned toward military ends. Germany lost the war the moment it decided that America was not worth taking seriously, that Americans were too soft, too divided, too individualistic to fight effectively. The final accounting is harsh but clear. Nazi Germany, for all its early military successes, for all its tactical excellence, for all the skill and courage of its soldiers, was defeated by forces it had convinced itself could not exist. A democratic society that mobilized more completely than any totalitarian state, an individualistic culture that achieved collective purpose without abandoning individual freedom, a consumer economy that proved capable of producing military equipment in quantities that no command economy could match. The arsenal of democracy that Hitler mocked in 1942 buried the Third Reich by 1945, and the miscalculation that made that possible stands as one of history's most consequential strategic errors. The lesson endures. Arrogance is a strategic liability. Ideology that prevents accurate assessment of opponents is a path to defeat. The quiet strengths of democratic systems: adaptability, resilience, the ability to harness diverse populations toward common goals, can prove more decisive than the dramatic strengths of authoritarian efficiency. Germany learned this lesson at catastrophic cost. The world, watching the war's outcome, learned it as well.